Hi guys, here's my new bass board. This thing's really quite complicated and it took quite a while to put together. You might be able to see it at the bottom on camera. I need to neaten all the cables up around the back. But it took quite a while to get this all together. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what's on it, why, how it's wired up, and there's going to be bits where you see me building it, and then we'll do a bit of a demo and talk about what's where and why. So the main purpose of this board was to have a couple of drives that were 50-50 blended with an original signal, a compressor that was also 50-50 blended so I could have a proper parallel compression thing going on, my clean and kind of gritty amp channels, but with a virtual cabinet so that I don't need a bass amp at all. I can go to any stage anyway, give them an XLR and I'm done. The big beast, the Korg Multi-FX, is something that I had one of these for years and I've just got one again. And I'm mostly using it for things like octaves, pitch shifters. It's got step control, which I use on certain songs. And it can do nice things like chorus as well. Not as well as like an analog chorus could, but quite often I'm throwing that in for a song here or there. More importantly, the routing on this was really quite crazy. I've got a bass wire going on, I've got the low bass, and then yeah, I'm blending all these, which are in an insert path through the Korg, which means that I can switch them in and out without having to step on any of those separate pedals per song at least. I've got a choice of distortions up top. I've got a Boss Metal Zone, which has got quite a nice buzz in terms of a bass distortion because it's blended in with the original signal. I've got an MXRL Grande bass fuzz, which is a bit more controlled actually. And then there's the Rev G4, which is an absolute grinding beast. I can have those off and switch my 2 notes la bass onto what is a distorted channel but in a completely different way, because that's not 50-50, that's more like a vintage amp channel the way that I've got that. That's really quite grindy. And so let's look at the way that I thought about this, a couple of things that changed in the build, and then the wiring together. So this board is kind of silly, but a lot of it's practical. It's just laid out in a really strange way. So the entire idea behind this board is to try and have not only everything that I could possibly want in a live setting, but also have like emergency outputs and emergency kind of inputs, that kind of thing. So I'll talk you through the aim of the board. Nothing's been velcroed down yet. That's the next step because I've just been trying to work out the wiring of how I would want this to go. Not because I want the simplest option, but because I want the most efficient option for me. So the idea is that separately I'm going to have my wireless unit, which is the Line 6 G90, which could be anywhere on the stage. Having played a lot of shows, I can tell you that you don't always know where your rack gear is going to have to go depending on the stage layout. It might be practically so close to you that you're tripping over it, or it might be a good 60 feet away in the wings, which for the G90 system for the wireless is actually not bad, but also my in-ear receivers are in that same rack, so that quite often needs to go closer to front of house depending on what it is. Anyway, I'm rambling. The point is, what I want is for that G90 system to have an XLR balanced output that can run a long way, because with it being balanced, it's not going to pick up any excess noise, which means that if need be, I can run a really long cable out to this board and not pick up extra and noise and that kind of stuff. So that's going to go into this reamp box. That's why I've got a reamp box on here, even though I'm not technically reamping. What this is doing for me is converting that high output line level beast of a signal from the wireless into something that's then unbalanced and guitar level and everything that it should be before it goes into the rest of the gear. But then the cable going from that to the next piece of gear is then this long and is not 40 feet, 60 feet long, or however long that's got to be. Means that I've got a much more efficient way of putting the wireless where I want it and having this right under my feet. So then the reamp is going to go from here into the 2 notes La bass. This is the core of my sound. The 2 notes La bass I found is an absolutely fantastic preamp. The clean A channel. I tend to have the gain on it round about the middle, and what that means is it's still clean, but if I start to dig in and give it a slap pop kind of thing, I don't get really big nasty transients. They're kind of softened off like you would get on a low to medium gain bass amp. And then the drive channel has a kind of a crunchiness, and I set it quite mid forward and have it to have quite a lot of guts, but kind of like something like an Ampeg SVT when it's being driven quite hard. So it's not fuzzy, it's not mushy, it's just gutsy, but all the definition is still there, and if I play more gently, it cleans up quite well. So that's my main thing. And then I'm going from there, if I remember rightly. Yes, then I'm going into the Ibanez Weeping Demon. The Weeping Demon is a bass wire. Well, it's not just a bass wire, it's a guitar wire as well. But I chose this for the studio because not only is it a fantastic sounding guitar wire, but it's got a low setting which lets the low end through, which means that I don't have to do anything clever with the routing there. It's got adjustable sound with 3 different knobs to change the Q and the sweep and everything to suit either a more metal sound or a more funk sound, a more bass orientated sound. And you can click those knobs in so that you can't kick them during a show, which is always handy. And this big lever here changes it from a regular wire to a sprung wire. And when it's a sprung wire, that means I can take my foot off it. And as I take my foot off, there is a particular cut-off time, which is a tiny knob for. And when I'm not touching that, it's off. It turns the entire bass wire circuit off, which behaves a lot like other companies' bass wires. So that's fantastic. I can't see myself using that in very many songs, but it's there, and if I want to, I step on it, it wires, I step off it, it stops. And I don't have that awful feeling when you know your tone's up and you don't know why, and it turns out that you've left your wire on. We've all done it. From there, this is where it gets a little bit clever, because now it goes from here straight into this big, massive Korg unit. That's the AX3000B. Now, I had one of these 10 years ago when I was at university, and I absolutely loved it. Thing is, the amp models in it are particularly poor. The cabinet models in it are particularly poor by modern standards. And then, so you'd say, well, if you're not using those, well, what's the point? But this thing does a lot of other stuff that I might want to pull out the bag in the middle of a show. It can do things like kind of a virtual fretless and that whole slow attack thing, which I sometimes like. It's got things like choruses, flanges, rotary effects, which again I would use very, very rarely, but when I do, it's nice to have it here. There's even things like delay, which I would, again, very rarely use, but it's there. And reverb, which I pretty much would never use, but by the by. The things that I really wanted this for are the synth mode, which I really love the sound of, which I can use on songs like Starlight by Muse or Paradise by Coldplay, those kind of big kind of sounds that no distortion pedal is going to get you that sound, where a synth has that particular kind of tone. And the other thing in it, between the synth and the pitch shifter in here, those are my real magic bullets, the secret weapons, because this pedal has a step sequencer which you can control the speed of, and it's an eight-part step sequencer, so I can program in things like a pitch shifter with an arpeggio, which I can set with my own notes in my own timing. So something like Starlight by Muse is a great example. In the breakdown, in the kind of the pre-chorus, there's this big kind of synth that goes. If I can program the pitch shifter on here to be that kind of step that goes up and then down, which I know I can do, I can literally, with my bass, just go one note, then the octave, then just pick out the chord sequence and let that do the rest for me, which means that our guitarist, because it's only a trio, the guitarist can then focus on doing the guitar parts and doing big melodic reverb drenched lead lines and that kind of thing, and I can really fill out that space, and then that is half the tone done right there. This also has some very useful features that will come into play in a minute. Now, this is where things get a little bit clever, because at the top, I've got a flatly bass compressor, a Boss Metal Zone, an MXR bass fuzz, and the Rev G4. Now, apart from the MXR bass fuzz, none of these have a dry blend, which could be a problem, because especially with the distortions, you lose all the low end and you lose all the definition. So, the idea is to blend the original signal with this top row. So what we're doing is the 2 notes La bass has a through output, which doesn't get affected by its preamp circuitry at all, and that's going to feed up to the bass compressor, which then means that I've got a 50-50 blend, and that's going to go through the distortions to this ABY box here, which is permanently going to be on Y mode, which means it's going to combine the original signal, which comes out of the insert send on the Korg, which is another direct version of the signal, with the distorted version of the signal, and they're going to go together back to the return on the Korg. So the Korg unit has an insert loop, which is switchable per preset on here, and that comes before any of the effects on the pedal. And that means that most of the time I'm going to be leaving that on, because then that means that I can have things like the pitch shifting and synth stuff on here, but at the same time have all the distortions and that kind of thing on a 50-50 blend with the clean signal, and then get that processed by anything on here. But then at the same time, if there are any times like that breakdown in Starlight by Muse where I want the synth to go, but I don't want the original signals to come through at the same time, all I have to do is turn off that insert for that patch, and that then cuts that and means that we've got that clean signal without all the distortions and such going on. We're almost home and dry now. I was always saying the cabinet emulations in this were always terrible, and that's where the 2 notes cab M comes into play. I'm not entirely sure which bass cabinet I'm going to choose yet. I think it's going to be the Brit Fridge T, which is one that I made, which was an 8x10 Marshall cabinet with a tweeter in. So I get some high end, but I also get that booming low end. And that's got an XLR out with a ground lift, so that's going to go straight to front of house. And also, the Korg unit has stereo out. So one of them's going to go to that, and the other one, this is going to go on the bottom of the board. This is a Behringer Ultra DI. It's cheap and cheerful, but what this is going to be for, mostly, this is going to be my emergency. So if for some reason, I don't know, if the cab M doesn't work, or I don't know, then I've always got this option. And this has got a link on the output, so if for some reason I decide to use a backline, then I can use a backline straight out of here, and that will then go to the amp without the cabinet processing on it, so that the front of house can have the cabinet sound. I can have the backline not be doubled up on cabinets, as it were, and also then just have a clean XLR output. And then in the future, if I decided to record something with this rig in stereo, I could use 2 notes wall of sound on the other side of this to replicate the same or different cabinet, have a stereo bass setup with any of the synths and choruses on here and that kind of thing being in full stereo. Why not? So, There's a lot to go at here, but the method is there. The madness is also there. So the wiring is mostly thought out. The first thing to do now is Velcro up any pedals here that don't already have Velcro on them. And that is quite a few of them. So without further ado, here we go. Alright, so now that that's done, Velcroing first means that if I do this, the pedals don't come off. Which means that I can turn this upside down and look at the next important thing, which is the power. I have also noticed that there's a bit of an issue here with stepping on some of these distortions, especially the metal zone above here. That's something I think I'm just going to have to deal with. I might switch round at this point. Yeah, I'll switch round. Oh, great. Make sure that's on there nice and tight. None of this has been properly stuck down yet, but if I stick that there and that there, it's much easier to lean over and press that button. And I think I'm going to tape down the controls here because when I'm using this live, I'm going to be using it in more of a preset kind of mode because I don't really have the time live to be doing that kind of thing because I need my sound now. So yeah, that's all going to be taped off and then just using those 4 preset buttons and then changing banks where relevant. What I need to do is forget the audio cabling for a minute and look at this. So this, and don't crucify me here, this is a Harley Benton power supply, which at first I was really quite doubtful, but it's isolated on every single separate power output. It's got 2 switchable channels which can do 9, 12 or 18 volts, which is great for me and is the reason that I got this, because that means that the 12 volts negative tip I can use for the cab M and for the La Bass, and those will do 500 milliamps each at maximum, which I know the La Bass can use up to 500 milliamps, but it very rarely does apart from when you first turn it on, and the cab M uses 200 milliamps, so that's plenty spare for the rest of the kit on here. The next thing is the Korg AX3000B, uses 9 volt negative tip. It uses apparently about 300 milliamps when it's running, which is what this is capable of per port. And then we've got just distortions and a compressor and a wah, which all use next to nothing. I can actually see on the wah, it tells me that it uses 9 volts, 41 milliamps, which is absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of things. The only downside for me now is I have 6 isolated 9 volt outputs and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 9 volts that I'm going to need, which means I'm going to use a daisy chain somewhere, and I think that daisy chain is going to have to be the ABY pedal and something, probably the metal zone, because just, if I daisy chain 2 pedals together, one of which doesn't cause any sort of gain or anything, in theory at least, that should minimize that risk and have every other pedal on its own separate isolated output. That should absolutely minimize any chance of any sort of power supply bleed through. And that means that I've got everything going here, and I can tell they're isolated because they even have their own relays. If one of these turns red in normal operation, other than the power in, then you panic and you disconnect it because something's gone wrong. And it's all separate, and it can tell when each one's on. It's not just a feed through LED. It's really quite clever and for the money. Again, not sponsored by THOMANN, but the design here is pretty cool. They've probably copied somebody else. I wouldn't know who, but the idea is sound, and so far this has worked for me beautifully. So under the board it goes. This is going to be probably velcroed in, but also cable tied on so that it's really not going anywhere. And same for this DI going underneath. That's going to have to be cable tied on because there's no other real good way of doing it with something like this. But this, like I said before, is just the emergency out. So this doesn't have to go particularly in a pretty orientation. So without further babbling, let's get on with that. Right, so there's a couple of audio cables stuck out here, and that's because a couple of them, when I was testing the routing out, the only way to get them neatly was to pop them through this really quite thin hole here, so they're going to have to stay. But later on, I can cable tie them down as needed for neatness. There are some cables still on here from the previous iteration of this board. They're going to go. But in the meantime, before they go, let's just make sure this still, yeah, that fits. It doesn't fit quite in the same way that whatever power supply was supposed to go on here fits, but it fits nonetheless. At this point, let's remove all of the power that's on here from the previous iteration, just to clean us right up. And now it's all together, we've got these kind of options. So let's start with everything completely clean. So at the moment, all that is the 2 notes La bass on the A channel, which has none of the top row on at all because the insert isn't on the Korg. And then that's going through to the 2 notes, which has the bass beast with a 421 and a Yamaha sub kick on it. And that's it, that's my tone, I'm done. And it sounds absolutely monstrous as far as clean tones go, because I don't like super clean. I like it so that when I do dig in, it compresses a little bit naturally. Not compression, just not ultra DI clean. That's also got the bass wire at the front, so if I decide to do a bit of bass funk, I can kind of do that with it. Or I can go onto my La bass B channel, which is more gritty, but if I play it gently, I can get a really nice vintage tone out of it. If I wind my pickups on this jazz bass all the way to just the neck pickup and dig in on this channel, I get a very early Black Sabbath-y kind of tone. And that's quite kind of trashy, but can also be used if I palm mute to get a proper... So there's a lot to go out without even getting anything involved. Now if I switch on the Korg from this patch to this patch, that has engaged the top row, which right now is the metal zone and the compressor. Now it's quite noisy. Maybe I'll... Oh. Yes, no, sorry, that was the MXR bass fuzz. Turn that off and get the metal zone on instead. So that's quite biting, but a bit more modern. It's got that low ending. It's not as mid-forward. And turn that noise off again by switching back to taking out the insert. If I switch from that metal zone to the Rev G4, you'll really hear this jump. So So I've now got a choice of drives and I can switch them in and out. And like I say, this ABY box is giving me the 50-50 option. And because it's all going through a virtual cab, I've got the cab taking some of the nasty top end off those distortions. So instead of going like, oh no, oh God, it's like, oh, that's okay, that's quite nice. And so, yeah, I get my choice up there of fuzzes. Now, when we bring the Korg in, we can get really clever. So I'm going to start with the El Grande bass fuzz on, and I'm going to switch in this channel, which, as you can hear, has quite a lot going on. And in fact, I'm going to have a look at the noise reduction here. Seems like the noise reduction on this program's doing nothing, so here we go. But this is a very Muse-inspired tone. This is the Metal Zone and the compressor blended 50-50. Then the whole thing sent into an octaver, which gives us that very... If I make that more of a Metal Zone. And I could really bring that to the fore by putting the G4 in. I have to say the G4 reacts the most organically of the three, that's easily true. Now, this is where it gets clever, because if I do the step sequencing thing, now we're getting some real sweet noises. If I use that, and the next program up is, because this is stuff I would use on Starlight by Muse. So the next section in Starlight after the breakdown has a kind of the sequencing thing going on, but quite a light bass tone. So my compromise there is to take the insert out, which has the drives, but keep the pitch shifting going, which will give me that. And then at the end of the song, it's going full on crazy with all the distortion and all the pitch shifting and the original signal blended back in, which is dialed in through here. So that sounds a bit messy, and I think especially when everything's in, the pitches that it's going through should probably be in a higher octave. But that's something I'll do at a later date. This is something I've literally just put together in this 20 minutes in between building the board and filming this part. So there's a lot I can go at and a lot I can change. If I change to the G4, not the Metal Zone as well, on this preset, I can... That's probably going to get me in trouble copyright-wise, but hopefully it's slightly different enough that we'll kind of get away with it, because there's no original music in here. But this is to sound like the tones you can get from Starlight by Muse. But also I'm going to do things like on the next bank up, I'm going to do something like Paradise by Coldplay, which is probably going to be a fuzz plus an octave, and maybe an upper octave as well, just to give it a bit of something. Probably not going to use the bass wire much. The only thing I'm not testing on this board today, by the way, is this Reamper. The Reamp, the wireless kit is over there, and I'm probably going to test that next week. But the only thing I need to check is that the levels kind of match between this and the balanced XLR being converted out into here, because otherwise that should be absolutely a good drop in. This is what I would do, and this is why I've arranged the board in this layout. This is what I would do if the wireless kit either isn't with me, or the batteries die, or any number of things that can go wrong with wireless kits. All I have to do is unplug the wireless's input onto the board, take a regular old cable out the base, stick it in there, and the show's back on. The DI box, it turns out, doesn't quite fit underneath. So I'm either going to find a way to mount it somewhere, or I'm going to find a smaller DI box to sit underneath, because it is just an emergency thing. I don't really need it for the purposes of what we're doing here. So hopefully this has been fun and you've enjoyed looking at all this kind of stuff. I might even replace one of these drives with an analog bass chorus at some point, but again, it's all money. I've managed to do this with what I have. So a big thanks to Two Notes for helping me out with, I bought the La Bass, but they've sent me the Cab M, and I've done a review of that, which just came out. It's a fantastic piece of kit. Thanks to Rev for sending me the G4, and thanks to Flatley for the bass compressor, which I did a load of videos for Flatley a while back. And yeah, a big thanks to you guys for helping make a lot of this kind of stuff possible. This is going to be really interesting working with this soon and making some videos for you all to see. So I'm very excited to start working on those. And I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this, feel free to check out our other videos, as you can find here, or check out our Facebook and Twitter, or our Patreon page, which helps us to make more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.